Kate LaFalcia, welcome to Psychics and Psychos. This is part three. And of course, this is Irish Granny Helen. And today I'm going to talk about the murders, the crimes of Charlie Manson. Now, for the sake of YouTube, I want to make it clear from the start that the only reason that we'll be using words like death and murder and that, you can't talk about Charles Manson and not use those words. What he did, what he encouraged others to do, egregious, psychotic, psychopathic, criminal. I'm not going to linger on the details. If you're so inclined, the information's out there. We have to be very careful these days about our vocabulary here. But I think most of us are familiar. You're going to be surprised, I think, when you hear about the crimes of Charlie Manson were far more than what most of us recognize. So let's start in the spring of 1969. His first victim, of which we're aware, that's the caveat. This guy is, a true psychopath, criminally versatile, as we know from a very young age, completely lacking in an ethical code or empathy. But this starts the string of events that we're familiar with. Now, some of these are 100% proven. And when they're not, and they're speculated, I'll let you know. But they're speculated with a strong sense that they're probably his work. Okay, so the first one was in the spring of 1969. A man named Bernard Crow Black, who was a dealer. And I'm not talking cards. His nickname, because they all have nicknames, was Lots of Papa because he was big. They called him Lots of Papa. Kind of cracks me up. Anyway, Manson began to realize that he was not going to make it big in the music industry. And he was really worried that if he wasn't a big star, he would lose some of his followers because he saw Wilson and Melcher distance themselves, and he was afraid that his allure would wane if he didn't become a star. So he decided that he would have to create a situation that would tie the family to him. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that he thought this out this well. I think it was innate feral sort of instinct that he had. So he decided to create a crisis and to prepare his family for what he believed was going to be the upcoming race war. Now, once again, on behalf of YouTube's sensitivity about words, I want to make it clear that this is not my set of beliefs. We're discussing the crazy ideas of Charles Manson that led up to the very famous events of August of 69. So these are not my words, not my beliefs, not how I feel about anything. But Manson convinced the family that they would all have to migrate to Death Valley, where there was a hole in the desert, and they would dig into this hole and they would live in it. They would access an underground city in a hole under the desert to hide from what he said was the Black uprising that was coming. He told them that Black people would create chaos. Now, I do not believe this. Because of YouTube, I want to make this very clear. This is Charlie Manson's words. These are Charlie Manson's words. And of course, none of this came to pass because he was a lunatic. But he believed that when the chaos died down, the family could emerge and they could dominate the planet because they would have hyper-propagated, had lots of babies, and because they were superior, if you know what I mean. He was just a huge racist. It's pretty appalling. So he needed money to carry out this big scheme of escape into the valley. He was kind of an early survivalist kind of guy. So he set up a deal with Lots of Papa, and Manson told Lots of Papa that he would sell him $25,000 worth of grass for $2,500. And so he took the money from Lots of Papa but he didn't have anything to give him in return. And lots of Papa got very upset, and he threatened Manson, and he threatened the family. So Manson went to his house, lots of Papa's house in Hollywood, and in the chest. He told the family that this is it. This is what's going to start a war with the Black Panthers. I've done it now. Now, meanwhile, back at the ranch, I've always wanted to say that. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, some of the freeloaders there were the Straight Satans. This was a motorcycle gang, and they were encouraged to hang around because Manson regarded them as his protection. They were also racist, and they hung around for the girls, and he encouraged it for the protection. So lots of Papa was number one, victim number one. Victim number two was a more familiar name, I think, if you know the story of the family, Gary Hinman. Now, Gary Hinman was a music teacher. He had a little house in Topanga Canyon, and in July of 1969, he was making mescaline to sell in his kitchen. And in July of 1969, he made a deal to sell some to Danny DiCarlo. Danny DiCarlo was one of the Straight Satan motorcycle gangs guys who was living on Spawn Ranch. So he made this deal with Gary Hinman and brought it back to, actually, DiCarlo used Bobby Beausoleil as the middleman. So the Straight Satans decided they want to buy this. Bobby Beausoleil goes to Gary Hinman and gives him, Danny DiCarlo gave Bobby $1,000 to give to Hinman. So they get the product back and they don't like it. They didn't think it was any good. So DiCarlo is absolutely furious and demands his money back. So Manson was worried about this friction, because he was afraid that the Straight Satans would get mad and move out of the Spawn Ranch, because, they gotten the recommendation through Bobby Beausoleil. Bobby Beausoleil was one of the family. Manson feared that the motorcycle gang would blame the family for this deal gone wrong, and they would just leave in a snit. So then they would lose, of course, their protection against the Black Panthers. So Manson thought that Hinman had money. He's got money. He can pay his money back. If not, he's got cars. He had a number of different cars on his property. So Manson sent Bobby Beausoleil and 3 family members with gun and knife to threaten Hinman and to demand the money back. And Hinman didn't have any money. And Bobby spent the next, quite a long time. I forget how much time they were there for, more than a day. I think they might have been there for 3 days. I don't want to exaggerate. They were there for quite a long time. And, they did things to him. And he had nothing to give them, And so Bobby Beausoleil from Hinman's house called Manson back at the ranch, told him the story, and Manson said, "Oh, you know what to do." And so they stabbed Hinman, and they wrote with his blood, "Political Piggy," on the wall of his house in order to implicate the Black Panthers. So, Manson's always cooking something up. Well, somehow, and I didn't really go into this, but Bobby got arrested for the murder of Hinman. And Manson thought that if they could stage a similar murder, then it would look like, well, Bobby was locked up. He couldn't have done that same murder, that same MO, and the police would have to let him out. So one could speculate that he knew the house on Cielo Drive had been Melcher's, and probably somebody elite was renting it because he'd seen Sharon Tate. He knew Jane Sebring. So there's always been speculation. Had he been at that house before? Some people say yes. Some people say no. It's uncertain. So then we come to August 8th of 1969. And once again, this is a difficult story to tell, and I'm not going to go into the gory details. So 4 family members were sent by Manson to Cielo Drive. They got there, they cut the power, and cut the gates. They fiddled around at the front gate and were met by a car getting ready to leave. And Tex Watson had been told by Manson, destroy everybody there and make it look really gruesome as possible. So they get to the house at midnight. They encounter this car with Steve Parent in it. Now he was 18. He was visiting the caretaker, William Garrettson, who was a pal of his, and they were hanging out, listening to music, living in this little bungalow on the property, the same bungalow that the owner lived in when Manson came looking for Melcher. And the owner had moved away, probably thought, oh, I'm getting out of here, and rented it to, hired Garrettson. You can live in the bungalow and you're caretaker of the property. So he had his friend, Steve Parent, come over. Steve's getting ready to leave. He encounters, the unluckiest person in the world encounters the Manson family. And Tex shot him. Now, they left Linda Kasabian at the gate to stand guard. And the rest of them went in. They climbed in a window. The first person they encountered was Chakowski, who was asleep on a couch. And he was good friends with Sharon Tate. They woke him up. Susan Atkins stabbed him. And then Tex finished him off. 51 stab wounds. Next, which would be victim number 5 now, is Jay Sebring, who apparently he'd met Manson before. He was shot and stabbed 7 times. His girlfriend, Abigail Folger, she was the granddaughter of the Folger Coffee Company people, very wealthy, Hollywood elite, she ran out. She had been in bed. She was in her nightgown, and she ran out onto the back grass, and they chased her outside. Krenwinkel and Watson did, and they stabbed her 21 times. And then they killed Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant. It was gruesome. She was stabbed 21 times. Then they wrote pig on the front door in Tate's blood. There's a very disturbing picture of her husband the next day, Roman Polanski. He was in Europe making a movie. And, he had to come back to this unbelievably horrendous situation. And there's a picture of him sitting on the front stoop by the door with her blood, spelling out pig on the doors. Really terrible. But Manson was not satisfied. He wasn't happy with this. He felt that they had botched the job, is what he told them. It was too messy, it was chaotic, it was disorganized, and it wasn't adequately framing the Black Panthers, and it wouldn't spark a race riot. So he wanted to try something else. So I have to tell you, when this happened, I was about 69. I was about 15. I thought I was 14. I was about 15. I was babysitting my neighbor's kids, and the news came on, and mysterious murder in LA, and it freaked everybody out. And we're going to talk about this in a minute here, probably the next video, about the psychological effects of this. It was terrifying, and I lived 100 miles away, and it was terrifying. And it happened again the next night. I remember going home after babysitting and telling my mother about it. And she said, oh, well, that's sad, but don't worry about it. Not going to happen again. It happened the next night. So the next night they drove around. He went in the car with them, the same group as the night before. Charles went with them this time with Leslie Van Houten and Clem Grogan. Clem was a nickname. And they drove around for hours, but they finally came to a neighborhood where Manson had been to a party at a house. Well, they didn't go into that house. They went into the house next door, and they had victims 8 and 9. The LaBiancas, he was a rich grocery store owner, and his wife. And I remember when it happened, they seemed really old to me. I think she was like 35. Anyway, they carved war on the man's stomach, and they used blood to write death to the piggies and rise on the walls. Sorry for the details, but it's significant to create a political reason for the crime. Manson felt this would kick off Helter Skelter, his fictional race war. Three weeks later, he got suspicious. Okay, so there was a police raid at the ranch, and they came after stolen cars. And he decided that the stuntman, Shorty Shea, with whom he'd already gone face to face, and they didn't like each other. He thought Shorty Shea was an informant, that he'd told the police about the stolen cars. So Clem, Manson, and Bruce Davis went together in the car, and they disappeared him in the desert. He was victim number 10. And he was found 8 years later, buried on the ranch, because Clem Grogan told the cops where to find him. So Charlie got ratted out, basically. So what happened was Bobby Beausoleil had a girlfriend, Kitty Lutzinger, and she'd gotten scooped up in this big raid. And she was in jail and didn't have any money to get out. And other people were bailing out, and she wasn't getting out. And she was really upset. And they had, I don't know if she had old warrants. I mean, these people were all at least petty criminals. And so she was languishing in jail, and she had tried to flee the family. She was terrified of Manson. She and another girl had walked across the desert all night to get away from them. But her information, she wanted to talk to the guards, and she told them about what she knew about the murders, which wasn't a lot, but it was enough. And her information led them to find prints at the scene that belonged to a couple of the family members, and it cracked the case open. Eventually, Manson bragged about having killed 35 people. This is how sick he is. He sent a map with 35 crosses to mark where all these bodies were. He mailed it to Sharon Tate's little sister. So there's a string of other murders. So we've got, what is this, 10? Yeah, that's 10 that we know for sure. Then there's a string of possibles that they attribute either because of the MO or the proximity or the connection that they had to the family. So the first one is Nancy Warren, who was 64, and Clyde Delaney, a 24-year-old who was with her in Ukiah. And it was some sort of connection to the girls. Then number 3 of the possibles was Marina Elizabeth Habe, who was only 17. She was a student at the University of Hawaii, but she was from California. And she came home on vacation from school, and she was staying with her mother in her mother's apartment. And she was seen being abducted. She went down the street to her car, or she was getting out of her car in front of her mother's apartment one evening. And that was the last anyone ever saw of her. Her body was found. Then there's Darwin Morrell Scott, who was 64, and the name Scott might ring a bell. He was Manson's uncle. Remember Colonel Scott? So he was Colonel Scott's brother, and he was found stabbed in his Kentucky apartment. Witnesses said they saw the preacher, which is what they called Charlie, in the area, and he was out on parole. So the 5th possible is Mark Waltz, who is 16. He was a family acquaintance, and he was associated with Spawn Ranch, and his body was found shot on Mulholland Drive. Mulholland Drive is this winding, circuitous, basically a uninhabited area in the hills above LA, panoramic views of the city, cliffs on one side, sheer drop on the other, and beautiful views. But a lot of people get dumped up there. A lot of the Hillside Strangler victims ended up there. The sixth person is potential is John Hott, who was 22. He joined the family in 1969, and he got arrested with a large group that were arrested in relationship from the ranch, or relationship to the Tate killings. Manson believed he was an informant, and the story is he was accidentally shot by himself playing Russian roulette, but the gun had been wiped clean. Then number 7 and 8 are James Sharp, who was 15, and Doreen Gall, who was 19. They were found stabbed in an alley with the same MO as the Tate victims. And interestingly enough, they were very active Scientologists. And Manson was really into Scientology and knew people from the world of Scientology, and had, I think it's called auditing, had 100 plus hours of auditing. So there is a connection there. The next, number 9, is Reet Jorvitson, who was 19. I believe her father was, I want to say, a diplomat. He was a foreign important person. This is November 16th of 1969. She was stabbed 150 times. Then we have number 10, Joel Pugh, 29. He had married Sandra Good. Sandra Good should sound familiar. He made Manson furious because he married her. And he was in England, and he was found killed in England. And lo and behold, Bruce Davis was there at the time in London at the same time. Then there's number 11, Ronald Hughes, 35. And this is one of the creepier stories here. I always thought this was really weird. So he was a young attorney. He was Leslie Van Houten's appointed attorney, her defense attorney. He was only 35. And Manson didn't like how he was running her defense, because Manson wanted to do it himself. You know, as all good psychopaths do. They want to be their own attorney, and they want to testify on their own behalf. Pure sign of a psychopath. But anyway, he accosted Hughes. This was like before a long weekend. And he accosted Hughes in the courtroom and said, "I don't want to see you in the courtroom again." Very threatening. So that weekend was a long weekend, and Hughes went camping. And he never came home from camping. There had been heavy rains and flooding. And he was never found. People absolutely, they don't know what happened to him. But Sandra Good, you know, the one who married Joel Pugh, Sandra Good later said that Hughes was one of the first retaliation murders. So there's reason to believe. Number 12 is James Willett, who was 26. He was buried in the wilderness, and then his 19-year-old wife was killed and buried in the basement of the home that Manson and the girls were staying in, to shut her up because she knew what they'd done to her husband, James. Number 14 was Lawrence Merrick, who was 50. He was the director of a documentary about Manson, and Sharon Tate had been his former student, and I guess Manson didn't like the documentary. Then there was number 15, Michelle Minano, who was 21. She was the sister of an associate of Manson's. She was found executed in a tunnel, and they think that they shut her up because she had information about the death of the director of the documentary. So let's talk about the investigation and the trial. I remember this time, and every single day there was something in the news about the Manson family and their fooling around on the sidewalk outside the building where the trial was being held. They got kicked out of the courtroom, then they got kicked out of the building because they were so disruptive. They were always chanting and singing and standing up and complaining, and a lot of performative head shaving and carving of their faces. They were absolutely unbelievable, and they loved the attention they got. The press fed it. You know, they would interview them outside on the sidewalk. Crazy. So Manson wanted to be his own attorney. Of course he did. And the first thing he did was violate a gag order. and started making outlandish, nonsensical pretrial motions, according to the judge. And he got rid of the first judge on day one. I mean, it was just chaos the whole time. He showed up in court with an X carved in his forehead, and he told everybody, I've been X'd from the establishment world. So all the girls on the sidewalk put X's in their forehead the next time everybody saw them. They turned the trial into a total circus. The lawyers had them subpoenaed, the girls, as possible witnesses to keep them out of the courtroom. And so they threatened other witnesses. Paul Watkins was attacked and burned in a very suspicious van fire, was very badly hurt. Barbara Hoyt was doped up with LSD, put on a plane, and taken to Hawaii. But it didn't stop her. She still testified. Jurors assured the judge a number of different times that the antics that were going on here were not influencing them. They were listening to the evidence. When Manson was denied permission to question a witness himself, because, he had a lawyer, and he wanted to do that anyway, he jumped over the table and lunged at the judge, tried to attack the judge. And while the bailiffs wrestled him to the ground, the girls stood up, because they were still there, stood up and chanted in Latin while the bailiffs were struggling with this lunatic. The judge started to wear a very prominent gun at his waist. The defense rested. They called no witnesses. Manson told his attorney that the girls would all take the blame, and they would claim that Charlie had nothing to do with it. He put them up to doing that kind of lying on the stand. And so rather than have them perjure themselves knowingly and be a party to it, they didn't call any witnesses. In 1987, there was a documentary, and Krenwinkel was interviewed, and she said the entire proceedings were scripted by Charlie. When Manson testified, because they always do, the courtroom was emptied so that he couldn't use his quote-unquote hypnotic powers to unfairly influence the jury. In his testimony, he claimed that the crimes were not his fault, and the music told him to do whatever, and the music told him that the youth would rise up against the establishment. And his defense attorney, Hughes, then disappeared right before closing arguments, and it took them another 2 weeks, and this trial kept getting delayed. And I mean, it was a three-ring circus. So it was delayed for 2 weeks while they tried to get a new attorney up to snuff, and boy, you wouldn't have wanted to have been that attorney. The defendants were then banned from the courtroom for disrupting everything, especially because the prosecution was trying to do the closing and they couldn't get a word in. January 25th of 1971, they were all found guilty. And then in California, they have a separate penalty phase. So the girls, they testified during the penalty phase, and they said that the murders were copycat murders to get Bobby Beausoleil out for killing Hinman. Manson shaved his head and forked his beard and said, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." All four got the death penalty. They had 7 counts of first-degree murder. In 1977, California changed and got rid of the death penalty, at which point their penalty became life in prison. But because of some weird quirk, this made him eligible for parole. In 1971, he was convicted of the deaths of Hinman and Shorty Shea. So this new penalty law made him eligible for parole. Squeaky Fromm and Sandra Good, they moved closer to Folsom Prison to be closer to Manson. Good went to prison for sending more than 3,000 death threats by mail to a variety of different people. And of course, that kind of thing through the U.S. mail, it's a big old felony. But she eventually got out. Fromm, she tried to kill Gerald Ford. She was the first person ever in the country to be sentenced under a new federal assassination law. She escaped prison briefly. Oh, this just blows my mind. She escaped prison in 1987. She was caught, but eventually in 2009, she was released on parole. Manson gave 4 interviews from prison. And I tried to look them up, and it seemed there was an inconsistency. I think they were referring to 4 interviews that were public. Some of the people that interviewed him were writing about him, and they weren't made public. So he gave one to a documentary, to a documentary team. He gave one from Australia, 60 Minutes from Australia. He gave one to Tom Snyder. Tom Snyder was epic. Love Tom Snyder. He was, if you don't know Tom Snyder, he was a late night Los Angeles kind of talk show host, but it wasn't all smarmy and bizarre like, what's his face, Johnny, whatever his name was. And just late night TV was really weird in those days. And his was a little bit more intellectual, a little more interesting, just a really interesting man with a great sense of humor. And he interviewed Charlie Manson. And then Diane Sawyer interviewed Charlie Manson. And then a doctor interviewed him at great length and said, well, he's not insane. He's crazy like a fox. And we'll talk about that. It's an interesting conundrum. At one point in prison, he was burned by an inmate because he had complained about the inmate who was Hare Krishna, was chanting Hare Krishna chants, and Manson didn't like it. And he gave the inmate a hard time. I think he threatened him, and the inmate set him on fire. He was moved into protective custody at Corcoran, and then he was moved again to Pelican Bay because they found him trafficking substances. Then he was caught with a cell phone, criminally versatile. He did record an album while in prison. In 2013, he discussed his, I tried to find wording for this so as to not get in trouble, his pangender activities. He said, it's like going to the bathroom. And he said, I'm not hung up on that game, man. In 2014, he got engaged, but broke it off because this is classic. He broke it off because he found out that his bride-to-be planned to use his corpse as a tourist attraction. And he believed he would never die. So we're going to get into his psychology. I'll mention just a few things here. He had a history of controlling behavior. He had mental health issues that were diagnosed. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic, but then they changed it later to bipolar with psychopathy. He was diagnosed with paranoid delusional disorder. He was deemed too dangerous to be released, and so the parole interviews were pointless. He had 108 rule violations. He had no remorse, no insight, no understanding of the magnitude of his crimes, and a complete callous disregard for life. In 2012, they decided no more parole hearings for you until 2027, at which point he would have been 92 years old. But he died November 19th of 2017 of colon cancer. His body went to his grandson, Jason Freeman, and he was cremated. Now I'm going to end this here because the next part that I have to talk about is based on a couple of different a psychiatrist and a clinical psychologist who's a behavioral analysis expert. And they separately, 2 different things entirely, didn't know each other. They had analyzed him. And the psychiatrist is also the same guy that I read about Kohberger, the Idaho murderer, who compared Kohberger to Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky. He's very literary, but I find it an intriguing mental exercise. And so, especially what he said about Manson, very interesting. The clinical psychologist, who is also a behavioral analyst, played clips from Manson's interview with Diane Sawyer. That's really interesting. So we'll get to that next time. And then Denise and I will do our psychic evaluation. So I hope you enjoyed this. I told you, I warned you, it is unbelievable. This guy was so odd. Such an odd story. Very disturbing. And he's not the only one like that. So have a nice evening. Slung of oil, slanter.